Alright students, welcome to Chapter 2 of Health Science 349, Measurement and Statistics in Health Science. Alright, so our objectives for this chapter are to know how to read and calculate parts of a frequency table. This you will not find in your textbook. Also to know the three measures of central tendency, how to calculate these measures of central tendency, and then when do we appropriately use these measures of central tendency based upon the level of measurement. So again, hopefully you can see now that you need to understand and make sure you know levels of measurement from last week so you can start building upon that information for this week. So let's jump right in. Okay, so here we have a frequency table, and this is what you will see from SPSS. So you will create these on your own, and this is what you will see in your assignments and your exams and on your quizzes. So let's become a little familiar with what it's in these tables and how we read them. So at the very top we see W1 community, and this is essentially the name of your variable. And probably what this variable asked the participants was, what community do you identify with? And if we look to the left column, we see valid, and we have three possible responses for this variable community. We have Chamorro, Samoan, and Tongan. We also have missing, and we also have total, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But our next column is frequency, and this is simply going to be how many people identified with each of these responses. We have the percentage of each of these responses, a valid percent, and then also a cumulative percent. And all four of these things, no matter what variable it is that you're analyzing, will always appear in your frequency table. So let's learn a little bit more about each of these statistics. So frequency, this is nice and simply a head count, a tally. So you're going to have any answer for a variable, count of how many people answered that, and that's going to be your frequency. One thing as far as notation that we're going to use, and you're going to see throughout the semester, is little n. And little n simply means how many people responded for that answer. So the sample size for a given response. Our next column is a percent, and this is simply the frequency divided by the total sample size times 100. And this is simply just a percentage we can calculate for each category or each answer. So the formula would be percent equals sample size of the total sample size times 100. So again, we have little n is how many people identified or answered each response. So we had 4 people who said yellow was their favorite color, 5 people said that red was their favorite color, and so on and so forth. And so our total sample size is simply adding up all the people that we have in our sample that give a response. In this case, we have a total sample size of 20. Notice the notation for total sample size is big N, or capital N. So go ahead and take a moment and see if you can calculate the percentages of each of these 5 colors. When you think you've got your answer, go ahead and continue playing this video. But go ahead and pause the video now to go ahead and work through this. Okay, great. Hopefully you gave yourself the chance to work through this and were able to calculate the percentages of each of these 5 colors. So here we go. Yellow, we had 4 people who said yellow was their favorite color out of a total of 20 people. Times that by 100 and we get 20%. Do the same for red, get 25%, 30% for blue, 5% for green, and 20% for pink. And if we add up all of these percentages, it should equal 100%, right? So we would have 100% of our entire sample gave us what favorite color was theirs. Valid percent. So this column is relevant when there's missing data. So essentially, not every single person is going to provide an answer for every single variable, whether they skipped the question intentionally, maybe they didn't see the question, but for whatever reason, you have missing data. And unfortunately, and in reality, this happens all too often. And so there are other things that are outside the scope of this class that can be done to make up for missing data, But really, when we run frequency tables, we can see it actually tells us how many people do we not have data for a given variable. So here's a valid percent. Notice the numbers here are slightly different from our percent column. But if you look at our missing row, frequency 97%, 24.1. So really what this is saying is that 97 participants in this sample, and how big is the total sample? 403. So 97 people of the 403 people that actually received the questionnaire, or that we actually approached to answer a set of questions, 97 people did not answer this question about community. And that actually makes up 24.1% of the entire sample size. Okay, so let's go ahead and work through calculating the valid percent. So as we saw before, percent is simply the frequency for any given answer or response divided by the total sample size times 100. But the difference between percent and valid percent in the calculation is simply we're dividing by the total number of people who actually answered that specific question. Again, remember, we may have people who we approach to answer 10 questions. Maybe not all 100 people that we approached answered all 10 questions. So this is where we then use the valid total sample size as far as our calculation of valid percent. So here we see 21.6%, 44.4%, and 34% for valid percent for Chamorro, Samoan, and Tongan respectively. Go ahead and calculate it and see if you can get these answers. When you think you've got your answer and you've matched them up, go ahead and continue this video. Otherwise, go ahead and pause it so you can practice and work through this problem. Okay, so hopefully you worked through this and you were able to calculate the percent and valid percent and match them up with what we see here. And if not, here's simply how we work through it. As we can see, Chamorro percentage, 66 people out of a total sample size of 403 times 100 gave us 16.4%, which is just a regular percentage. But our valid percent, we still have 66 people who said that they identify as Chamorro. But we're not necessarily now talking about the percentage of the entire sample. We want to know of the people who answered this question, which in fact was 306 people, 21.6% of these 306 people identified as Chamorro. So the sample size that we're using for valid percent in this example is 306, not 403. And just the last note, just like percentages, if we add up the valid percentages, they should all add up to 100. This is why we see a valid total row as 100 under valid percent, but we see under percent, the total at the very bottom is our 100. We can see that 75.9% of people actually answered this question. Okay, and the last piece of a frequency table, cumulative percent. And really what this column answers is what percentage of people have a score that is equal to or less than a given score. Essentially, it accumulates and accumulates and accumulates from previous scores or previous responses prior to what we see on this table. So really this is in the case of ordinal, interval, and ratio variables, a cumulative percent can be interpreted as a percentile. And we'll talk about percentiles a little bit later. So if we look here at the distribution of final exam scores, here we can see that a score of 10 would correspond to a very low percentile, that about just 2% of the class scored a 10. Well, a score of 190 corresponded to a very high percentile. While only 2% of the group really only scored 190, we see that they are at the very, very highest part of the scores. So if we're looking at a frequency table, simply all we're doing is just simply adding up all of the valid percents up to that particular answer. And so I want to make sure that we're clear that SPSS will always give us these four statistics: frequency, percent, valid percent, and cumulative percent. But when we're working with nominal variables, such as this one in this case, it really doesn't order our categories any low to high or high to low. Really, it's completely random: Chamorro, Samoan, Tongan. So in this case, for nominal variables, cumulative percent really doesn't matter. It's irrelevant as far as trying to interpret cumulative percent with nominal variables. So let's go ahead and just work through calculating the cumulative percent. Here we have: how involved are you in American culture and lifestyle? Not involved, somewhat involved, very involved. And we had some people that we can see that did not answer this question. So if you look at cumulative percent, how many people said that they were not at all involved? We see simply 7%. And the way we do this is that we just look at the valid percent and move it right over to the cumulative percent for the first row. When we're calculating the cumulative percent for someone involved, we're really then asking how many people or how involved are you in American culture and lifestyle that really made up people who were not at all involved or somewhat involved. And if we're going to say that, really just going to add the 7% of not at all involved plus the 52.9% of people who said that they were somewhat involved, add those two to give us 60% of people who are not at all involved or somewhat involved. And lastly, for our last category, very involved, we're simply going to say there are 60% of people who are not at all involved or somewhat involved. Adding that to the people who are very involved gives us 100% of people who are not at all involved, somewhat involved, or very involved. It's simply how we calculate cumulative percent. So notice that the missing scores or percentages are not included in the cumulative percent calculation. And also, just like percent and valid percent, cumulative percent will always end with 100% at the last row. It's just like the 100 percentile, right? 100% of people said that they were not at all involved, somewhat involved, or very involved in American culture and lifestyle. 60% of people said that they were not at all involved or somewhat involved. You could also flip it around the other way, depending on how we set this up, and it could simply be that very involved can be in the top row, somewhat involved can be in the middle, and not involved can be on the third row, and you'd simply then have 40% of people were very involved, 92.9% of people were very involved or somewhat involved. So that's just another way of how we can see and set up and calculate and interpret cumulative percent.